It wasn't until the reign of Queen Mary I in the mid-16th century that England was ruled by a queen for the first time. Women were not expected to become rulers, but things changed after the death of King Edward VI. But some of these women became the greatest monarchs ever to reign over England and Britain. They defeated their enemies with ruthlessness and also fixed a number of issues. But some of these women had rather troubling demises and deaths. Some, like Elizabeth I, gave up and accepted the fate that was coming for them, with this accelerated because of their miserable lives. But some, such as Elizabeth of York, succumbed to one of the biggest threats they faced, childbirth. In this documentary, we look at the deaths of some of England's greatest queens, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Inside her bedchamber in Osborne House, her favourite residence, on the 22nd of January 1901, at the age of 81, Queen Victoria was gravely ill. She was a queen who had been on the throne for a huge amount of time, and the impending death of Victoria was a big problem for the nation that she had reigned over. It was such a long time since a monarch had died that the precedent and etiquette of a state funeral had also died out, and not one person in the country had any experience in dealing with this sort of event. But inside of her bedroom, the Queen, who had ruled for 63 years, was slipping away, surrounded by her family. She was a woman who was not very well, and she was also a queen who had suffered with depression and great grief and upset for years following the death of her husband, Prince Albert. But what happened in Queen Victoria's final moments? The year 1900 was regarded as Queen Victoria's horrible year. The Boer War, which had been fought between Britain and Africa, was on her mind, and she was rather anxious about this conflict. But also her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, was travelling through Belgium, and he had been shot by a young boy who was protesting against the war. But then her eldest daughter Vicky, also known as the Dowager Empress of Germany, had been diagnosed with breast cancer that was quickly spreading from other areas of her body, and she was inside her castle in Kronborg in severe pain. More horror came for the frail queen, as in the August of 1900 she was informed by a telegram that her favourite son, Alfred the Duke of Edinburgh, who was a heavy drinker and chain smoker, had died from throat cancer. Victoria wrote, "Oh God, my poor darling Alfie gone too, my third grown-up child. It is hard at 81. But further news would come, and her beloved grandson, Prince Christian Victor, the son of her daughter Princess Helena, had also died as he suffered from a fever while serving with the British Army in South Africa. But as 1900 came to an end, many tears would be shed as the Queen's best friend, Lady Jane Churchill, was discovered dead in bed whilst visiting Victoria at Osborne House. But the Queen was greatly affected, and she was quite clearly not well. She was 81, which by the standards of the Victorian times was rather incredible, and she was once sprightly, but this spark was going. She would not eat as much as she did, and she lost a huge amount of weight, and also Victoria was stuck in a wheelchair, and she could not see very well, and she often became very confused. She had reigned for over 60 years, and no one in Britain even thought about a time without her on the throne, similarly to what has happened recently with the death of Elizabeth II. She reigned for so long that no one had known any different. Because of this, her children would not accept that she was ill, and no preparations were made for her death. Victoria knew death was on the horizon as she wrote, "Another year begun. I am feeling so weak and unwell that I enter upon it sadly." The Queen at this time was inside of Osborne House, her favourite residence, which is on the Isle of Wight. She would spend her final days here, but the Queen was rapidly going downhill. But the royal doctors had to contend with the fact that the family could not see what was happening. Her doctor, Sir James Reed, who had treated her for decades, knew that Victoria was approaching her final days, and he spoke to the royal family about this, but none of them would accept that Victoria, who was considered the grandmother of Europe, was close to death. They could not even accept this when the Queen was delirious in her final moments. Princess Helena and Princess Beatrice did not believe that their mother could die, and they tried to keep things as normal as possible. But the doctors continued to squabble amongst themselves also, and many members of the royal family, when they were summoned to Osborne, were reluctant to come. The Prince of Wales and Victoria's heir was disappointed that he had to cancel weekend plans, and the Duke of Connaught was at the time en route to Berlin to celebrate 200 years of the Prussian monarchy. Others were at the theatre, but Sir James Reed, the doctor, would telegraph Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, but he realised the gravity of the situation. When he received this, he cancelled all of the celebrations, and along with the Duke of Connaught, the pair travelled to England, setting sail, and he then forced the hand of the royal family to make news of the Queen's illness public and to prepare the nation. The announcement took her subjects by surprise, and one headline reads, "Queen unconscious, sinking fast." But the tabloids had never handled this sort of story before, and they speculated actually that she was getting better. The Queen also, it's believed, could not accept that death was coming, and she asked her doctor, "Am I getting better?" saying, "I would like to live a little longer, as I have a few things to settle." Sir James then said, "Yes, your Majesty has been very ill, but you are now better." Chances are that this was the feeling better than some people experience before their deaths, before they go very downhill. And this is what would happen with Victoria. From the 17th of January 1901, the Queen suffered from a number of serious strokes, and with this the entire royal family was ordered to get to the Isle of Wight rather quickly. The government business then stopped as the Queen could not work and do her duties, and there were brief talks of her son acting as regent for the short period. But Osborne had an influx of guests. There were calls being made to the house every minute from the media asking for news, and people gathered outside of the gates. But Victoria was then sat there in bed, surrounded by her family in her small bedroom. The Bishop of Winchester was with her, along with the rector of a local church, who prayed for her and sung hymns. Kaiser Wilhelm II, her grandson, sat there at her left side for hours, and her doctor held her hand. The Queen could not see, and she said, "Sir James, I am very ill." But James Reed, the doctor, continued to reassure her. He said that she would get better, and nurses also offered support. Seeing Victoria in this state was distressing for the royal family, and there was a great deal of crying from the royal family. But then each son, daughter and grandchild, one by one, was summoned to kiss the Queen's hand and to say their final goodbye. At 6:30 in the evening, on the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died at the age of 81. The news of her death came out before the new king, Edward VII, had completed the formality of accepting the crown. An announcement was pinned on a bulletin board of the gates of Osborne House. The news of her death spread quickly around the world, and newspapers began to print their editions, and the bells of St. Paul's Cathedral tolled across the city of London. People wore black, and shop windows were covered in black mourning cloth. But as mentioned, there was panic in the royal family, as no one knew what the procedure was to plan a state funeral. Panic also gripped the government as Victoria requested a full military state funeral. She did not want to be embalmed, and she did not want to lie in state, and she specified she wanted white ponies pulling the gun carriage that her coffin was placed on. She also asked to be buried away from Westminster and St. George's Chapel, and at Frogmore with her husband Albert. Kaiser Wilhelm II offended the royal family as he ordered a death mask to be cast of Victoria's face against her wishes. But also the Duke of York became very ill, and the royal undertaker who swiftly arrived from London had forgot to bring the coffin. This meant that a local man was called upon to make the coffin of the longest reigning monarch at the time that Britain had ever had. It was said that the organisation was chaos, and when the coffin was built it was sent to Osborne House. The Dr. Reed, along with the help of the Queen's dresser, Mrs. Tuck, helped to prepare Victoria for the coffin. Victoria did not want to be embalmed, so on the floor of the coffin the doctor scattered charcoal to stop smells. They also cut her hair and dressed Victoria in a white silk dressing gown with a garter ribbon and star, with her wedding veil placed over her face. Then after this, the Duke and the Kaiser and the King then lifted her body into the coffin. performing a final duty and goodbye for her. As the family left, the Doctor and Mrs. Tuck performed the secret duties asked of them by the Queen. They placed a number of objects, including the wedding ring of John Brown, her Scottish servant, on her finger, and a lock of his hair in the coffin. The funeral procession was huge, and her cortege crossed the Solent, and a huge amount of soldiers came to London to be involved in the procession. It was the largest military procession since the Duke of Wellington's funeral, and it lasted 2 hours, but during this the coffin almost fell off the carriage, and it was not short of drama. The service in St. George's Chapel was rather chaotic, led by 2 archbishops who arrived too early. Also, the navy was half empty in the chapel, and they needed to have invited many more people. But then the Queen made her final journey to Frogmore, where she was interred inside of the same mausoleum of her husband Albert, and today they are laid to rest next to each other. Queen Victoria was a monarch who oversaw a huge amount of change in Britain. During her time on the throne, she had overseen large parts of the Industrial Revolution, ushering huge change to the country, and she would also become the head of the British Empire, which had a huge renaissance in its power and influence. She became known as the Empress of India, but the Queen, after 63 years on the throne, died inside of her favourite house. Her nation greatly missed and mourned her, and many at the time believed she was infallible and would have lived forever. But this was not the case, and surrounded by her family after being ill for some time,
Elizabeth's reign over England has gone down in history as the Golden Age, especially for art and drama. Elizabeth was also the last monarch in the Tudor dynasty, and she died without leaving an heir. Instead, she named James VI of Scotland as her successor. He went on to become James I of England, the first Stuart monarch of the English throne. In today's video, we will be looking at the suspected cause of death for Elizabeth, and then discussing what the agreed real cause of death of the Queen was. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Now, Elizabeth had a few illnesses during her life, and one of the most noteworthy is smallpox. The Queen contracted smallpox in 1562, and this left her with a scarred face. Elizabeth was only 29 when she became unwell, and unfortunately, this also caused her to suffer from partial hair loss. In turn, Elizabeth cut off her hair and opted to start wearing wigs. Thus, her trademark auburn wig was born. Because of the scars on Elizabeth's face, she also began to wear makeup. This makeup had a high quantity of lead, and as she got older, the thicker the layer of makeup became. Something that is of great importance to the aim of this video. Now, Elizabeth suffered from other ailments, and she started to suffer from melancholy as she reached her final years. Today, we would describe this as depression. This is thought to have been brought on by Elizabeth's realisation of her gradual deteriorating health, the passing of her close friends, and the fading of her beauty. In 1590, Queen Elizabeth lost one of her dearest and closest attendants, Blanche Parry. She was the Queen's chief gentlewoman of her privy chamber and keeper of the Queen's jewels, a highly respected position. Blanche had known Elizabeth since she was a child and was exceptionally regarded in her service, being treated as a baroness with gifts of material luxuries and land. Then, in 1598, another of Elizabeth's friends passed away. He was her adviser, William Cecil. He had been a devout confidant and supporter of Elizabeth since they were both quite young. These losses, among others, were devastating to Elizabeth. They were important figures and friends. Their passing made her a recluse, and she lost touch with the court she once dominated. For by this time Elizabeth was a lonely old queen. The tide then turned worse for Elizabeth. In 1601, only a year into the new century, she was forced to execute her former favourite, Robert Devereux. He had been tried before the peers of the country, charged with high treason and exposed as a traitor for planning a rebellion which included planning to kidnap the Queen. This understandably then broke the Queen in a way that could not be fixed. Elizabeth's health then took a further decline, and in 1603 she was noticeably unwell and reported to be in an unrecoverable state of melancholy, and therefore decided to retire to Richmond Palace, supposedly her favourite place of residence. According to Tracy Borman, Richmond was the chosen establishment because it was where the Queen could best trust her sickly old age. Elizabeth chose her company based on those who had been loyal and dependable. Her ladies were also decided by those who had been in her service for many years, women such as Helena von Snakenborg. Elizabeth is then reported to have become physically emaciated. She had begun to refuse enough food or drink, and it took its toll on her body. Elizabeth's physical state worsened, and it worried her ladies, who tried to encourage her to have a physician examine her. But Elizabeth was reluctant and refused on several occasions. Then another blow struck the Queen. She was grief-stricken. Her old friend and long-time serving lady, Catherine Howard, had passed away. Catherine was the Countess of Nottingham, and she had served the Queen for a staggering 45 years, and then died suddenly. This appears to have been the breaking point of Elizabeth's mental state, and according to court contemporary Anthony Rivers, the Queen loved the Countess well, and hath much lamented her death, remaining ever since in a deep melancholy that she must seemeth to be overtaken. By the February of 1603, Elizabeth was mourning the loss of her friend, but although she was depressed, almost 70 years of age and rather frail, she remained as stubborn as ever and retained her authority. Elizabeth is said to have stood for hours and refused to rest. Was she aware that her time was now limited? Elizabeth's ladies were said to have become that concerned for the Queen that they placed pillows on her bedroom floor in case she decided to sit. Her days became uncomfortable, with Elizabeth feeling guilty and rather regretful. It is said that these feelings are over the execution of her late cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth also became disarranged and discorded, and according to Sir Robert Carey, she shed many tears and sighs, manifesting her innocence that she never gave consent to the death of the Queen. She began to be plagued by ghostly visions of people she had previously known, including the late Scottish Queen and her throne rival, Lady Catherine Grey, whose son Edward had a claim to the throne. The Queen was dying, and it was obvious to all of those around her. She had become delirious, depressed, and her health was a never-ending downward slope. Eventually, Elizabeth made the decision to retire to bed, and not long after, with the Queen resting in bed in a senseless condition, the elderly Archbishop Whitgift was instructed to come to her bedside and pray for her immortal soul. He tenderly informed the frail Queen of the joys that awaited her in heaven. Then, on the 24th of March, 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died. She was in her 70th year and left an unforgettable legacy. There are a number of possible causes for Elizabeth's death that we have touched on. A popular belief is that Elizabeth's constant use of lead-lined makeup caused her to suffer from blood poisoning. Another belief is that Elizabeth could have suffered from some form of cancer in her final years, or Elizabeth could have suffered from a simple bronchial infection, which had later developed into pneumonia, something that is not unlikely due to Elizabeth's advanced age and weakened immune system. Unfortunately, there is no possible way for Elizabeth's cause of death to be 100% accurate, because quite frankly, no one knew at the time, and she refused to be examined, nor did she have a post-mortem. It is possible that Elizabeth ultimately died of old age, but ultimately, no matter the cause, Elizabeth's death was certainly hastened by her deteriorating mental health.
She is often overshadowed by the antics of her son, King Henry VIII, but Elizabeth of York is remembered in history as the mother of the Tudor dynasty. She was the wife of King Henry VII, and their marriage brought an end to the civil war known as the Wars of the Roses, and united the warring houses of York and Lancaster under one. But Henry VII agreed to marry Elizabeth before the end of the war, and he did defeat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth to take the crown for himself. However, their marriage, despite being one of unity, was one which was very important, and it would see the king and queen be devoted to each other. However, on the 11th of February 1503, Elizabeth of York tragically lost her life inside of the Tower of London shortly after giving birth. This left her husband, the king, distraught. But she was one of the first tragic people to die inside of the Tower, the same place that her son would slaughter 2 of his wives, one who was a queen. In 1502, the king and queen were expecting another child, and Elizabeth of York fell pregnant again. As was tradition at the time, Elizabeth entered her confinement inside the Tower of London, which was a royal palace and a favoured royal residence. It was the place where many kings would await their coronation, and it was not really a place associated with torture or execution, all that would later come in the Tudor period. But inside of her bedchambers, Elizabeth was to await the arrival of her child, and her room was decorated with bright symbols and tapestries to bring positivity to the birth of the royal child. However, on the 2nd of February 1503, this child would arrive, and Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter named Catherine, after her daughter-in-law, Catherine of Aragon, who had married Arthur Tudor and was now a widow. But tragically, after a few days, this child passed away from illness, and this sadly was too common an occurrence during the Tudor period, as around 50% of all children born would not make it past their 5th birthday. However, more tragedy struck the royal family, as 9 days after she had given birth to this daughter, Elizabeth of York was gravely ill, and she died from a postpartum infection. This was a heartbreaking loss for England and for the king, Henry VII, who was wrecked with anguish and heartbreak. His heart was shattered, and it was said that Henry VII departed to a solitary place, and would no man should resort unto him. He was utterly inconsolable, and many were shocked with how Henry dealt with this, particularly as he was a man who rarely displayed any emotion. But here the king was now sobbing his eyes out in front of his court. After Elizabeth's death, he retreated away, and he himself became rather ill, and only his mother, Margaret Beaufort, was allowed to care for him. He even sent the royal doctors away, but he did get better, and because of Elizabeth's death, the Tower of London became a place that was never really used as a royal residence again, as Henry VII could never return, as he would forever be reminded of his loss there. It became more of a place of imprisonment, execution and torture, but Henry VII then organised a huge funeral for Elizabeth of York. 2 members of his council took control of this, the Comptroller of the Household, Sir Richard Guildford, and also the Earl of Surrey, and Londoners even came together to help where they could. Bells tolled across London from all the churches, and Elizabeth's body following death was embalmed. She was dressed in her state robes and was laid out in bed. Her children were taken to see her body, and they blessed their mother goodbye, and when embalming was done, it was the sergeant of the chandlery who did this. He was given a number of materials for the job, and this included spices, balms, wines, and a lot of wax. Elizabeth had her body washed with wine and rose water, and various spices and balm were placed over it, and her body was wrapped in a cerecloth, and this had been cut into strips and was aimed to preserve the first Tudor queen almost like a mummy. Her entrails and also vital organs had been removed, but her body was then placed inside of a lead-lined coffin, and the wood was made from holly wood, and the coffin was once more wrapped in layers of black velvet cloth. Her coffin was then carried by high-ranking members of the nobility and was placed inside of the Tower's chapel. the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Her ladies held effigies around the coffin and stayed with Elizabeth's remains until it was time for the funeral. 500 tall candles surrounded it, and the windows of the chapel were covered with black cloth. Elizabeth's sister then took her place by the body, and she stayed with the remains, and 6 ladies at all times kept a vigil. Her sister was Elizabeth's chief mourner, and the funeral procession then began on the 22nd of February. Elizabeth's coffin was then at midday placed on a carriage, and this was then drawn out of the Tower of London. The coffin was still covered with the black and blue cloth, and on top of it was a lifelike effigy of Elizabeth, dressed in her robes, and on top of her head was a crown. Her hair was down to her shoulders, and in her right hand the effigy carried a sceptre. The fingers of the effigy were covered with gold rings, and lots of people witnessed the procession of the dead, and it was the first time most had seen any slight image of what their queen looked like. Lots of London's public were involved in the procession, as 200 poor people carried torches and were dressed in black, and the king paid for this. There were also many other members of the Queen's household, and the Mayor of London behind, and Elizabeth's 4 sisters also followed in carriages. The Lady Mayoress of London had 37 virgins holding burning tapers, standing on Cheapside as a mark of respect, one for every year of the Queen's life. And the city's churches were draped in black mourning cloth. It was a huge celebration of mourning and of Elizabeth of York's life. The funeral procession then went towards St. Margaret's churchyard in Westminster, and the coffin was greeted by many bishops. It was then taken into Westminster Abbey, and there were further banners draped around the coffin. That evening the remains of Elizabeth of York stayed inside Westminster Abbey, and it was surrounded by torchbearers and other witnesses, and her sister Catherine then oversaw a supper of fish inside of the Queen's chambers. During dinner, knights and heralds watched over the body and continued to do this all night, and over 1,000 candles burned throughout the evening. On the last day of mourning this continued, and more masses were said for Elizabeth of York, and the Bishop of Lincoln gave the final requiem mass. Then women were taken up to the coffin to say their final goodbye to Elizabeth of York, and they gave a number of offerings. But then the final interment was made. The effigy of the Queen was taken from the coffin, and the Bishop of London blessed the grave of Elizabeth before the coffin was lowered into it. Her servants of her household, including her chamberlain and ushers, then snapped their ceremonial staves of office and threw these into the grave. But there was an issue, as building work on a huge royal mausoleum which began during Henry VII's reign and later became known as the Henry VII's Lady Chapel was not complete. Because of this, Elizabeth was buried in a vault made for her in the crossing of the abbey between the choir and the high altar. When the building work was finished, she was then exhumed and moved to the new large tomb that was made for her and Henry VII, and on this showed a huge effigy of her alongside the king. Henry VII spent a huge amount of money on his wife's funeral, and this was, in today's money, around £2 million. It was a memorable occasion for all of those who witnessed it, with the mother of the Tudor dynasty being laid to rest inside of Westminster Abbey. Everyone came together to witness her procession, regardless of their class, and Elizabeth of York is today remembered as a woman whose marriage united a nation and brought to end a civil war. Her death was one which was not expected, but it showed the dangers of childbirth during the 16th century, and this did not get any healthier in the decades after. She was the mother of King Henry VIII, the Tudor king who's most notoriously remembered for having 6 wives. But sadly, Elizabeth was the first Queen of England to die inside of the Tower of London, a place where Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, 2 of her daughters-in-law, lost their heads, but also where Lady Jane Grey died at the hands of her granddaughter, Bloody Mary I. Her death was one that united a nation in grief, but devastated her husband.